Martin Wilsey.
I'm a very excited Shane McGalley.
I'm David Keener, and I'm not quite as excited.
And I'm Jeff Patterson.
And this is the Hourlings Podcast Project. Tonight, Dave's driving the bus. Dave, take it away.
Sure. Tonight we have a special guest, Jeff Patterson, who has been a longtime member of our writing group, but moved away to Atlanta, Georgia a few years ago.
6.
Oh,
Yeah.
That long? Holy
Yeah.
cow.
Wow, it has been a while. Although you do show up at our meetings every once in a while. So we're here to talk to you about your writing in general, but also you've got a story coming out in an anthology called Fantastic
Yes.
Detectives. Tell us about that.
I can tell you about the story. The story is called Sister Autumn and the Angel's Blade. And I tend to end up writing mysteries, even though that really isn't my purview all that much. But there's quite a few mystery series that I love. And one of them is Brother Cadfile by Ellis Peters. And Sister Angel is a story about a crime that takes place, a murder that takes place, that is apparently, upon inspection, tied to a very, very big battle that happened in the 30 years prior. I was trying to think of it as a Brother Cadfile story, but instead of the Crusades happening in his past, it was the Lord of the Rings happening in his past. And I was kind of inspired a little bit. There was a movie that came out on Amazon or Netflix several years back called Bright, and it took place in modern day LA, but the events of Lord of the Rings had happened at some point in the historical past, so there were still elves and there were still orcs walking around. And
that was the movie that starred Will Smith.
Will Smith, yeah, was in it. And I always really liked that idea, the idea of showing a modern world in the wake of an epic thing like that, a piece of epic fantasy like that. And I didn't quite want to do that, but I did love the idea of somebody somewhat disillusioned with the world from their upbringing. Sister Autumn is a nun in the order of the Jananites, who are all followers of this angel named Janin, whose skeleton hangs in their temple. And the Jananites are something I created for the story I also did for you in a couple anthologies ago, called The Iron Garden, which takes place in the same city. And so yeah, it's Sister Autumn and a friend of hers who works for the constabulary, the cops, who is a sentient gorilla, because sentient gorillas are a thing in the city, and as well as angels. Angels are also a thing in this city. The gods have gone away and the angels live amongst the apes and the humans. And this particular angel, who was at the crime scene, follows a compulsion to serve. So he ended up joining the constabulary as one of their patrolling angels. And he was one of the first ones on the scene of this particular crime. And the more they look into it, the more they realize that maybe that war from 30 years ago didn't quite come to an end.
Right, and I'm going to share the screenshot of the actual anthology.
Okay.
So if you can all see that, it's called Fantastic Detectives.
great cover.
I should add that you are actually the longest story in the anthology, and we placed you last in the anthology.
Oh, really?
Yes, which is usually the position of
Yeah.
well, typically you end an anthology with a very strong story.
Right. First and last. And I was first. Iron Garden was first in the other one. So I take that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. So let's get back to some basics.
Okay.
Are you a plotter or a pantser?
Ooh, I am a plotter. I was raised a plotter. Let's put it that way. But couple things happened. Number one, you guys and the writing groups that I joined when I was down here sort of showed me a lot of value in the pantsing bit. There's a writer who I know, who I follow online, who is a absolute pantser, because as far as he's concerned, if he knows where the story is going, he's not interested in writing it. So I was like, God, I wish I had that. That sounds like a
Yeah.
sounds like a condition.
That's called writing into the dark when you don't know.
Yes,
what's happening.
precisely. Yeah.
I do not like that.
Lights off.
Doesn't work for me.
Yeah. No, I am a plotter, but then something that happens, and it happened in this story as well, is I will have the moments. I will have the moments that I want to shock or reveal, or have the reader come to the point of understanding, and I try to space them out pretty well, and then I kind of figure out what has to fall into place for this to happen, and then I look at, okay, here's an ancillary character that can introduce this particular factoid into the story. And so I plot, and then usually about 2/3 to the end of the way of the first draft, I start all the parts that I highlighted as I went. I start looking at them going, okay, this has to go before here, but this character hasn't been introduced yet, so somebody else has to do it, etc. So I'm a meticulous rebuilder.
Yes, you got to get those breadcrumbs, especially since I will gently point out that while you don't think you're a mystery writer, all of your significant works of any real length have been murder mysteries in the setting.
Yeah, they have been.
I think you're wrong.
So, well, I'm not a. I have a difficult relationship with the subgenre of murder mysteries, and it's not with the genre itself. It's in which the way it is approached, because it is approached so often as purely escapist and purely a way out of the everyday world, that it gets treated almost ironically. The fact that that you can parody the murder mystery as often as it's been parodied, or even worse. I remember when they used to have the cruise on the Connecticut River, where they had the murder mystery take place while you were eating dinner, and the announcer came on and went, "It's a beautiful night for a murder," and I went, is there any other capital crime you could make a joke about like that in a commercial and reenact on a boat for everyone's entertainment? I was like, it's so weird that we've taken the worst thing that we do to each other and turned it into this lighthearted ha 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 ha. And so I roll my eyes at a lot of murder mystery conventions, but I do love the idea of uncovering something, and I do love the idea of using reason and deduction to actually determine what happened. And also, I love challenging myself to how much can we hide in plain sight? How much evidence can we hide in plain sight as part of the background that we get to go back to?
I like that point a lot about trivializing murder or trivializing violence. I think that's a salient topic that comes up in writing a lot. How much do you toe that line? Are you okay with being sort of humorous about these topics? Or it's an interesting thing to bring up. I don't have the answers. I just think it's worth discussing.
But there's also there's more to it than that, in the fact that even in this story, Sister Autumn and Govan are making jokes with each other because they have this particular rapport. And if you watch something like Law and Order, where the cops are joking all the way through this very serious thing, and you think about it and you go, okay, well, if your job is to basically look at horrifying sights on a daily basis and then go figure out who caused them, yeah, you're going to have gallows humor as well as PTSD and a few other things. But so that I can see as a component of it, but at the same time, the fact that there have been so many actual parodies of murder mysteries There's been the Clue movie and Murder by Death and that weird
Well,
TV version.
I think
Murder
there's a
by Death.
couple streams though. Like, for instance, there's kind of the private detective one where the murders might be, gritty and down to earth. And then there's sort of the type of mystery that was maybe first exemplified by Sherlock Holmes and, later by Agatha Christie, that are more like puzzles. And
Yeah.
if you think of them as puzzles, I could see being kind of flippant about them. But if you think about them as, a bloody life torn away,
Yeah.
it's not quite as humorous.
Yeah, it's a different story.
Yeah.
I mean, not to mention it, Jeff, I mean, we have children's games. Clue itself is a
Right.
children's game about murder.
Right. And let's face facts. I mean, Columbo and Monk, those are comedies.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, those are comedies, and it's the love of the character and the fact that they are so good at what they do. And in the case of Monk, he is overcoming an issue. He is overcoming a condition that prevents him, that it is partially makes us good at his job, but also kind of does that. And I kind of wanted to do that with Sister Autumn too. She has a thing about paradoxes, as I like to say, and she also too has this compulsion, almost as bad as the angel who helps her. She has a compulsion that when she starts something, she really has to get through to the end and figure out what the actual thing is. If it gets stuck in her craw, forget it. She can't let go of it. Describing
the characters that you have here, is there any Terry Pratchett influence with this?
Only in so much as, not so much this story. There was a little bit in Iron Garden, the previous story that took place in the city of Orphica, also known as the City of Blasphemers, including the nickname City of Blasphemers was kind of a Pratchett-esque thing. But for me, a lot of it, the one thing that I do take from Pratchett and several other authors is setting as character. The fact that his world or worlds was always as much of a character and contributed to the plot as much as it did. And this really happened in Iron Garden, not so much in this story, which mostly takes place in this one House of Ill Repute. But yeah, when I did Iron Garden, City of Orphica was Buddha-Een by George Alec Effinger. It was New York from City Made Great by Jemison. Taineron by Lena Crone. Mail from Another City, where the whole idea is that the city is the reason at least 15 to 20% of the events that actually happen. And Walter John Williams wrote a great story called Metropolitan that took place in a place called Jaspier, which was he wanted to write what he called a totally urban fantasy where the magic and the element of the fantastic happened only because it was an urban environment. So anytime we build these giant buildings, it creates this kind of magical currency that people lust after. And I wanted to do something like that. I wanted, in Iron Garden, there's like 15, 20 different neighborhoods that get name dropped that all have different settings. And I do that a little bit in this story as well. But this one primarily takes place in the part of town known as Sinners' Quarters, and where the bad things happen. So.
Gosh, pretty ambitious, it sounds like to me. No wonder you can get any of these stories under 18K.
Yeah, well, I really wanted to with this one. This one had to get cut down quite a bit too. But when part of it is something else that happened, I was in the middle of writing another story featuring a character called Naroda Sin that I've written a few stories about, and I wanted there to be this little bit about 2/3 of the way through before the climax started that really had some heavy anti-war sentiment. And I was writing this before we pulled out of Afghanistan too. And I was writing this particular bit, which was pretty vicious concerning the reasons for a lot of wars to be fought. And then this idea for the story came to me, Sister Autumn, and I started writing it. And I said, this is also kind of an anti-war allegory, even if the war is something that had to happen, because if not, the bad guy would have taken over the world. And so I wanted that feel to be in it. I wanted that. I was not aiming for a Vietnam allegory, but I've had 2 people comment that it's a Vietnam allegory, and I was like, okay, as long as you get my point, I'll take it.
And I think, honestly, I like some stories that have some bite to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be bludgeoned over the head, for by a particular theme, but when it's an integral part of your story, I think it adds some power and gravitas to a story.
Mm.
All right.
So I always ask every author that comes on the show a couple of specific questions. What is your least favorite piece of writing advice?
Ooh.
The one that you think is so wrong. And the other one is, what's your favorite piece of writing advice that can pry from your cold dead hand?
Okay. All right. The one that I think is wrong is the very old adage of write what you know. And the reason I say that is because if I'm only writing what I know, I'm not doing research, and research is the collection of raw data that I then hammer into a story.
Yeah, it's pretty notable for science fiction fantasy writers too.
Yeah. So there's a big chunk of that I think is incorrect. I understand the need for people saying that, and I would never discourage anyone from writing if that was their approach. The best piece of advice was something that I got very, very early, probably in my 20s. And that was when I wrote a story that I submitted to a writing group that had a pretty traditional ending for that type of story. It was a near future science fiction piece with a big chunk of action. And it had 2 guys fighting. One guy fights better than the other. Boom, bad guy goes down. And one of the girl that ran the group was like, this was a good story until you got to the ending. And I was like, yeah, I didn't really care for the ending either, but that's how stories end. And she was like, no, write the ending you want. Write the story that you want, how it's going to play out, how it's going to actually, what is the impact? What is the fallout of this? And so I started thinking about that, and it sent me down the path of, and I do this with just about everything I write, is that I think about what are the secondary and tertiary effects of the event in the story. I want to know what's going through the minds of the people that are at the edges of this, and this is something else I do bring up in Sister Autumn, the other people that are involved. I mean, there's you watch Avengers, or you watch Batman versus Superman, and there's a Man of Steel, and you see the inside of an office of everybody running up to the windows to look at the big fight that's going on outside, and you're screaming in your head, get away from the windows, to these characters. And then they actually addressed that, because it also happens in the first Godzilla movie. And when they did the Godzilla versus Kong movie, you actually see the fight from the office, and everybody's getting the hell out of the office. It was like the director said, fine, I'm gonna address this. But some people are idiots. So I think about that. I think about if I try to tell a story that's linear and straightforward, that really doesn't address the fact that there's ugliness off to the sides, I feel unsatisfied. I mean, I'm not trying to be, you know, the child and look, everything is terrible. I'm not trying to be that guy, but yeah, being able to actually explore a neat idea. I've written a couple things in the past couple of years that were just like, oh, here's a neat idea. I wonder what would happen. And I wrote it and people liked them. And now I'm like, okay, I should figure out what to do with this now.
That's how it works.
I have a question.
Sure.
Where do you think, I know you're a big reader as well of
Mhm.
sci-fi and fantasy. Where do you think the genre is heading?
Oh, that is, oh, it's, I think it's going in many different directions. And I think it's going in many different directions for a lot of different reasons. I don't think all of those reasons are good, but more power to the people that are doing it. There has been both an increase and a decrease in quality of narrative that I've been reading a lot lately. Some writers who I've been reading for quite a while, who are still pumping out, you know, Alistair Reynolds and Linda Nagata are still knocking it out of the park every time they do it. But I've also really tried to read outside of my comfort zone for like the last 10 years. And in doing that, I've tried to dip into some of the other stuff genre-wise that's happening. And some of it, a good chunk of it is probably me just not getting it, but some of it, it's like, okay, I can't be doing all the work here, please. You need to be sort of telling me what's actually happening in the story.
Well, I think I have an analogy. I feel like we're living in another pulp era. Like
Yeah,
the 30s and 40s where lots of people published all kinds of stuff in all kinds of magazines, and most of it, you know, it was entertaining for people at the time, but most of it hasn't survived and
yeah.
isn't read today.
Hmm.
With a few exceptions, like, you know, Conan the Barbarian, for instance, came out of
Yep.
that time period, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like we're in another pulp era.
I think you're right in that regard. And I'm kind of glad that um, gatekeeping as a judge of talent has sort of become a thing of the past with the sort of different options. I still think there should be some when it comes to how certain things are looked at and judged and pursued and understood. But at the same time, I mean, we're seeing. I mean, my favorite subgenre is space opera, and I eat that up. But I eat up a lot of weird fiction, and I eat up a lot of horror, and I eat up a lot of various other things. And if I'm hearing a lot of buzz on something, I will go and pursue that and read it. And everything I pick up, I give it 100 pages. I go, you've got 100 pages to that's the test drive. If at the end of 100 pages I'm not certain what's going on, then I'm out of here. There was a book that came out recently that was part of a series that I read that I said, this is basically somebody played a multiplayer video game, wrote down what happened, and published it as a book. I was like, this was not a novel that was written. Somebody took their RPG and don't get me wrong, RPG, you know, self-published RPG lit is big on Amazon. There's a lot of it going on out there, and I get the appeal to it to people that are involved in that. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, Storm Mage comes in the door, and I'm like, well, okay, why is he a Storm Mage? How did he get onto that path? What brought him to that particular role? What went wrong in his life that got him waving a big staff around? You know, that's the kind of thing I like to imagine. But yeah, it is somewhat Wild West, but at the same time, there is a lot of other stuff that's coming. There's been a lot of really good what they were calling solar punk and eco science fiction that's being done right now that takes a very realistic utilitarian approach to a lot of things. there's a lot of authors from the early 2000s who are really kind of hitting their stride with the big picture.
They also call that climate punk or sometimes hope punk.
Yeah, yep.
Although hope punk is sort of anti-dystopian, and a lot of climate punk is dystopian.
Right.
Yeah, the explosion in subgenres just in the last 10 years is really wild. And I can really see the analogy with Pulp Fiction because, you know, it's
yeah, I read a book. I read a book about a month ago. It was a collection, and God, I wish I could remember who edited it. It was a collection of all the various Sherlock Holmes ripoffs that appeared in magazines in the wake of Sherlock Holmes becoming popular. And there were just so many of them. And some of them were outright parodies, and some of them were these sort of weird pastiches where they were having a thinly veiled version of Holmes meet historical figures. And some of them were outright making him, you know, an idiot.
Yeah,
And
my favorite was Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of different series of these that appeared regularly. It was an entire subgenre that was just either paying homage to or making fun of this one particular.
I eat those things up. I can't tell you how many Sherlock Holmes books I have in my collection.
Oh yeah,
that have nothing to do with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah,
from the Holmes Dracula file to you name it.
Oh yeah, I love that book.
So with Fred Saberhagen.
Yeah, love that book. Love that whole series. Old friend of the family, and yeah. But I think, I mean, it's definitely, first of all, SF definitely has a future and fantasy, which is something I really couldn't say in the late 90s. I mean, for as many good books that came out in the 90s, when we were getting towards the turn of the century, there was a lot of garbage coming out that was immensely popular, but was just left such a sour taste in my mouth.
So I see you as kind of a mashup writer.
I'll take it.
I look at some of your stories and I go, well, it's a mystery, but it's a horror, but it's fantasy, but it's space opera, but in a fantasy setting, stuff like that. So how do you feel about potentially marketing or trying to get the word out about mashup type stories?
It depends on what it is you're mashing up. I mean, let me put it this way. When I did Iron Garden and I wanted the city to be a character, what my mission ended up being on that story was how many science fictional ideas could I get into a fantasy story and it still legitimately be a fantasy story. And the reason part of this happened was I wrote something for science fiction, SF Signal, called World Building in a Bipolar Universe, and it had to do with Marvel and DC Comics and the fact that both Marvel and DC Comics are universes where science fiction things and fantasy things happen in equal measure, and everybody's fine with that. You know, a man from another planet has the Sorcerer Supreme on speed dial. And I was talking about the fact that this never really happens in books, and the two examples I gave were Honor Harrington is never going to become the Archmage, and a Berserker probe is never going to land on Westeros. And I submitted the piece, and then I went, what would happen if a Berserker probe landed on Westeros? And that's how I kind of started going.
I think the death toll would go up a lot higher than what George R.R. Martin has been doing lately.
So that's kind of how Iron Garden started. It was the whole idea of this thing came to this world and started doing something that is clearly magic as you start reading it, and as you get deeper into it, you're going, oh no, this came from somewhere else, and it's doing something far more insidious than just cursing these people.
Well, I enjoyed that. I did buy it, so I did enjoy it.
Yeah, so mashup to me is a big. It's not something that I'm aiming for, that I'm striving for, but I'm trying to make it. It's not even so much that it has to be plausible, provided that it follows through with whatever the theme of the story is, whatever made up technology I've used, whatever weird historical event that I've thrown in there. whatever properties a specific material has, provided it works in the story and it makes sense, and you've opened the door wide enough near the beginning of the story to say, yeah, this is the kind of thing that's possible. I think possibly one of the greatest door openers of that type of thinking when it comes to story writing has been Rick and Morty. The fact that Rick and Morty has gone down the holes that it's gone down, where it's addressed the sexuality of dragons, where it's addressed what goes on in the head of a clone, where it deals with, you know, many worlds interpretation, and the fact that it's done it as funny as it's done it, but also the fact that it's not trying to adhere to any strict scientific rigor. It's not even trying to be strict internally. I think the creators of the show once said it's not canon until somebody writes it. You know, it's just, it exists in the ether until somebody actually puts it down on paper. And I'm so glad that show came out after I had written a bunch of stuff that I had written earlier in my life too, because I was like, okay, I'm not crazy for thinking it's all right to have something like that happen. So, yeah, so I think that's really had a degree of impact on a few writers, especially the ones that are trying to write the funnier stuff.
So who are your biggest influences?
What was that, Marty?
What are you working on now?
A couple things. I'm working on another Neurotistan story, and I've actually, ever since David mentioned what he planned on his next fantastic titled anthology to be, I've kind of been wrapping my head around that, because I've got a couple of stories that I workshopped a while ago but never finished, that sort of fall into the category. And so I've kind of been putting my brain on hold. I really haven't worked aggressively on anything since November. I've kind of been giving my head room to kind of exercise, and I got some other stuff going on that I've been dealing with. And some of you may not know, but many, many years ago, my ex-wife and I used to do holiday cards, and I collected them all in a book that I self-published a while back called Solstice Chronicles. And I redid it as an ebook with all 27 stories that we had done. And I'm actually thinking about taking that up again as well. A couple of people were trying to say, you should really do another holiday story. And I hadn't done one since 2014. Been kind of busy.
I think I read that one. You published it in one of the Hourlings anthologies.
I published one of the stories, yeah, Roadside Epiphanies. I rewrote it because in the 7 years that I'd written it, all the technology I wrote about was completely obsolete. So I had to rewrite the whole story make it about social media.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Yeah. Oh, trust me, it's the number of news stories. I finished one piece a while ago, and then within 8 months of me finishing the piece and submitting it somewhere, it was getting a lot of the things that I had happen in it were showing up in the news, and I was like, "Oh, good Lord, this isn't good." Which is why I don't try to write near future stuff anymore.
So where's the next Sister Autumn story and the next? I cannot pronounce the lady's name from the
Igenia?
Garden.
Igenia.
Yeah. Igenia.
I don't know. Like I said, I am thinking about going back and doing a longer version of the Iron Garden, because there was a lot of material that got dropped in there. And I'm also thinking about the city itself and what kind of story could take place there.
Well, you've got two stories, so in all honesty, 60 and 18K, you could publish that as a volume, where you could add a couple more stories to it and publish.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know. I really haven't put a lot of thought into that. I've had this one other project that's sort of been rattling around the back of my brain that has a really neat title and a really neat concept at its center. And I've got 4 or 5 pretty major plot coupons worked out, and I've got a few characters worked out, and I think that the setting concept, the characters, and the plot coupons all work really well. I just don't have the story yet. I just don't know what story I can tell that contains all of those things. And so I'm kind of letting that stew in the stir in the vat, in the cauldron for now while I figure that out. And I've been doing a bit of rewriting on some other stuff as well. But.
All right. I asked this question before, but I think Marty and I spoke at the same time. Who are some of your biggest influences?
Oh, I'm all over the place with that because, like I said, I've really gone out of my way to read outside of my comfort zone. A lot of the people that were doing space opera and especially the high-tech SF in the 90s, Jeffrey Carver, Linda Nagata, I mentioned her before, big fans of them. Also, really big Alan Moore fan. I'm sorry, but he looms high, and that last collection, Illuminations that he did, I read that, and that sort of had a bunch of neurons firing. And I read Jerusalem right before doing Iron Garden, in fact. And he can't help but be a influence on me. Not even so much of an influence, but I go, nobody's ever tried to take the concept of a city or a setting and do this to it, or approach it from a given angle. And that was something that I wanted to do with the city of Orphica, which allowed me to do that. But there's been so much stuff that's come out. What's sitting behind me here? I've been reading a lot. I've been rereading a lot of, there's a great thrift store not too far from me that has a pretty good collection of a lot of the also ran books from the early and late 80s. You know, books that you remember seeing and that you probably read, but that you don't see around anymore, all those forgotten books. And somebody around here had a really big collection of those and has been feeding them to this thrift store. And I've been picking up, I go, I remember this book when it came out. And then I read it and I go, and there's a reason why it was forgotten. That's as much of an influence on me as anything else. When Alan Moore did his masterclass for BBC, one of the things he insists that you do is read bad stories. Because in reading a bad story, you know why, you figure out very quickly why the story is bad, or at least your version of why the story is bad.
Bad stories and bad movies. Yeah,
it allows you to. I work in broadcasting. All I do is watch bad movies, dude. That's so there's been a lot of that, and that's also been a bit of an influence on me when I see a cliche, or when I see a trope improperly handled, or when I see a character motivation that makes no sense, or when I see a series of actions that I go, how can this possibly have any consequence? I'm able to recognize it a little better. So I try to give everything a little bit of meaning. But there's still a lot of the people that I'm a big Catherine or Sarah fan. I'm a big Sarah Troyne, the current fantasy writer and editor. One of my favorite people. Have been online with her a lot, never met her personally. Her books are fantastic, beautifully written language. Anyone new recently? There's been a few new writers that have come up in 2022 that I read that I thought were really good. But I'm kind of all over the place with this. I'm getting older, and I'm sort of opening that aperture up a little wider just to see what kind of filters in.
Jeff, other than myself, obviously, what do you think about the Hourlings?
What do I think about what?
Other than myself, what do you miss the most about the Hourlings?
Oh, good Lord. When the place wasn't, I know you guys aren't at the same venue anymore.
Oh, we love the bakery.
Yeah, the bakery was fantastic. Also,
the Atlanta Bread Company, I really miss it.
Yeah, I really miss that too.
Those were the days, man.
Yeah, the other thing,
for our subscribers, we would go in and we'd take like six or eight of their tables or their little tables or something, and just slam them all together in one big table, and there'd be like 12 or 14 of us sitting around it talking about books.
Okay, but what the best thing is, like right next to us was like the art club, and they were doing like their little art projects. Like
Yeah.
it was like a whole meeting day.
Yeah.
It was great.
I will tell you something that I learned from you guys.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, part of me wants to say it was Dave who said it to me, but it wasn't. It was somebody else. And they said, we're holding you to it. If you're submitting something on a regular basis, we're holding you to it. And there was somebody who brought something in, and somebody said that I really want you to think about what you did here, and I want you to think about this before you come back and submit it again, and think about working on it. And you made the work on the piece real. There's a group down here that I've been part of that's an open group. It's an open door group that you bring the piece, you read 2,000 words, and then you get the feedback. And it was the first group I joined down here because it was the only real one I could find. And it was a weird dynamic, and I understood why he wanted to do it, because he wanted it to be fully open door. Somebody has written something, they're terrified about submitting it to a group. If they walk into a tavern in Midtown Atlanta and they read it, they can, you know, they're making that first leap friendlier and easier to accomplish. And there's been people that have come in there that have read stuff, and we give them feedback, and they come back with the next submission, and we give them the exact same feedback week after week after week. And after a while, we've had cases where we've had to go, you're doing the same thing wrong every submission. If we give you feedback, bring it back and look at your next submission and try to apply it to that submission before you get to it. Because clearly this isn't your best attempt. And that was what I learned from you guys was, you know, if make it the best attempt. And if I, you know, 9 times out of 10, I bring a piece to a group knowing I have failed to do what I wanted to accomplish. And I'm trying to figure out what else is going on here. And so narrowing it down to the people that want to do it better and the people that want their work to be improved by it is a very, very important ethos. And you guys were the first group that I really saw put that into practice. And like I said, I'm parts of 3 different groups down here, on and off, depending on what my schedule is. And they are, you know, I have, in talking with the leadership of that group, I've brought things up, and I'm a long-standing member in all 3 of these groups. And I've kind of tried to bring that kind of an ethos to those groups of, look, this is, if you're bringing us submissions from the draft you finished a year ago and you're not rewriting it before you bring it in, you're doing it wrong. You really need to listen to the advice that's being given to you. It's your story, do with it what you will, but you're coming in here and we're giving you the same feedback every week. That kind of stuff I feel the need to address, because I'm not doing either of us any favors when we do that.
Yeah, I don't mind critiquing even the worst story. It's just, it's time and effort on my part and everybody else's part, so I don't want that time and effort wasted.
Yeah.
If you're gonna act on the advice, why am I doing this, and why are you here?
Precisely. It's a lot of people go in there with an expectation of, hi, I'm going to get praised for this, or hi, someone's going to tell me, yes, you're doing it right. Even if somebody walks in the door with a piece that is unworkable, and I've seen this happen multiple times, where the piece is just unworkable. They're not certain what it is they're trying to do. They just have a sequence of events that occur. And the first words out of my mouth were going to be, you walked in here and you read this out loud to us. You've just done the hardest part. Now you're going to go back and rewrite this thing. And being able to instill the idea that, yes, your job isn't to write a first draft. Your job is to write a terrible first draft. And then you go back and...
Well, hopefully your job is to write the best first draft you can.
Yes, yes.
You get advice on what's wrong with it.
Yes, precisely. There was an author who was at Multiverse down here, and I'm blanking on his name, and we were doing question and answer, and I said to him, he was talking in his day job, he deals with interpersonal relationships, and I said, I'm in a very contentious relationship with the younger version of myself who keeps leaving me these awful drafts that I have to rewrite. And he said to me, never forget the word is revision, literally revision, looking at it again, going, there is something here, something can be made of it. And embracing that and leaning into it is kind of the important things. You guys were the first writing group I ever saw practice that on a regular basis and actually say to somebody, this isn't your best work. This isn't your, you put 80% in last time. You're at about 40% with this one. You need to work harder on this one.
Well, Jeff, it was great seeing you again.
Yeah.
Thanks for stopping in for the podcast. Any final words?
Nope. Looking forward to the release of Fantastic Detectives and reading all the other fun stories in there. And thank you for having me in it.
Great
Cool.
to have you, man. We
Great
love
to
you.
see you again.
Awesome.
Take care. We'll see you guys.